Well, welcome everyone. We've heard a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act over the last day and a half, hugely impactful. And we're here to talk about both how it's going to affect the energy transition, but how it's also affecting our friends and allies across the water who have some concerns about it. For the one or two of you possibly in the audience who don't know about the Inflation Reduction Act, it's pretty landmark legislation, $36 billion a year over 10 years. It puts the U.S. on track to meet its 2030 nationally determined contribution. It's a combination of tax credits and loan guarantees and grants, and it covers a lot. It covers clean transportation, clean energy, and transmission, CCS, and nuclear. Along with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the CHIPS and Science, it's the largest effort to tackle climate change in United States history. The hope is that it's going to drive innovation, bring down the cost of technology, accelerate the transition, and reduce emissions. But it's controversial because there are a lot of strings attached. Some of those are domestic content, some of those are prevailing wage, and so it has raised some issues. But you have to remember the context. The United States had 2 decades of attempts and failures to have a climate policy. We tried cap and trade, and that didn't work. Bipartisan opposition to a carbon tax. And very short-term investment tax credits and production tax credits, which frankly were pretty hard to build a business on. So we have this bill, and after years of failure, we've now joined the global effort. But you have to also understand that this bill was a national security bill. A lot of what drove the consensus for passing this bill was concern about the U.S. not having an industrial base, not having a value chain for clean energy, and frankly having to depend on China in particular for a lot of the materials and sources for this. So it was a national security bill, and it's also a strategic approach. It is meant to go fast and spend quickly in order to drive change fast. So we're going to dig into all these issues. How big is it, and how fast will it be deployed? How much it changes the U.S. as an investment destination, whether this really needs to be a zero-sum competition with Europe, or whether that can be fixed, and how important, how material it will be in advancing the energy transition. And we have a fantastic panel in order to discuss this. First, Brad Crabtree, who's the Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. He is the tip of the spear for the Department of Energy on the Inflation Reduction Act, and has a long history in developing the policies before you came to the government that are now in this bill. Next, we have Julian Mylchreest, who is the executive chairman and head of, executive vice chairman of global corporate and investment banking for Bank of America. He directs a lot of serious funding. Who's going to talk to us about capital flows. Next, we have Tim Holt, who's the executive board member and labor director of Siemens Energy. He's got responsibilities for the grid technologies business, as well as the North American and Latin American regions. And he's had a lot of experience in the energy sector in really almost every aspect of it. Next, we've got Ben Backwell, who is the executive director of the Global Wind Energy Council, an organization that represents the private sector wind industry globally, and really has both deep experience and a global perspective. And last but not least is Beck, Senior Director for Europe for the Clean Air Task Force, who also had a real leadership role in developing a lot of the policies which ended up in the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's our panel, and Brad, I'm gonna start with you with really 2 questions. Mm-hmm. The first is, how big is the Inflation Reduction Act in sort of driving change for the U.S. and how material? But second, you've also heard the concerns from Europe about how this is going to affect investment in Europe and the fear of deindustrialization. So talk a little bit about how you respond to those concerns as well.
Absolutely, thank you, and it's an honor to be here. I'll start with the first part in terms of impact. And you mentioned the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that passed a little over a year ago before the Inflation Reduction Act. You can't really talk about impact without talking about both pieces of legislation together. The Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure legislation was nearly $1 trillion, investing in U.S. infrastructure comprehensively across the economy, but $62 billion was provided to the Department of Energy for investment in all things energy and climate. And that's to be spent over a 5-year period. So it's a concentrated half-decade set of investments that will be made. And it's especially important for emerging technology. Just as an example, there's $12 billion for carbon management, over the 5 years, depending on what you include under hydrogen, $8 to $10 billion for hydrogen, and other investments. And it's not just the technology, it's the associated infrastructure to start to build out the ecosystems that we need. And that's maybe one important thing to say before I shift to the Inflation Reduction Act, is that there's a major policy change embedded throughout the infrastructure bill. Historically, the United States did a really good job of investing in research and development over decades. But we did a very poor job of investing in the commercial demonstration of the projects that we had successfully developed with that R&D money. And now the infrastructure bill allows us to devote resources directly with industry to commercial scale demonstration of the critical technologies we need. So what happens now with the Inflation Reduction Act is it brings that tax credit package that other speakers have talked about, well over $300 billion estimated over 10 years for clean energy and industrial tax credits. And there's a couple of things that I'm sure other speakers who are actually doing the business part of this will talk about the value to their industries of how this is structured. But first and foremost, we have a 10-year window now. Rather than authorizing these tax credits for a year or 2 years and then have them lapse, Congress has created a 10-year runway so that any project beginning construction for between now and the end of 2032 will be eligible. And industry in the United States, and perhaps, I'm not sure, perhaps very few other places in the world has had that long of a time frame for incentives with which to plan and invest. The other thing is, for emerging technologies such as carbon capture, hydrogen, and other things, tax credits are hard for some companies to monetize. So at least for the first 5 years of claiming the tax credit for emerging technologies, companies can choose to take that tax credit as a direct payment, cash. And so that will have a really significant impact on the ability to leverage private capital into project development. So you take that all together, what does it mean in terms of impact? In terms of the US government and our estimates, we're expecting between the combination of the infrastructure legislation and the Inflation Reduction Act, between now and 2030, about a 40% reduction in our emissions. Our goal as a country is 50 to 52% in that time frame, so it's a significant down payment on what we have committed to achieving, globally in terms of our own emissions reductions. If you look at it, and I'll just give you one, I represent the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and so I'll just take that set of technologies as an example. In fact, my friend and colleague Lee Beck, the Clean Air Task Force, sponsored the Rhodium Group to do analysis of what would be the combined deployment impacts of this of these two pieces of legislation on carbon management. And the estimate is that between now and 2035, we will see an increase of 210 to 250 million metric tons per year of annual carbon capture and storage that will result from the deployment from this tax credit. So on the upper end, potentially a quarter of a gigaton of annual capture and storage. That's obviously game-changing for our country. It's big enough that it has a global impact on the deployment of the resource. So that's just a sense of the scale. I would note also that we're already seeing response in the private sector. My colleagues met with an engineering firm here a few weeks back. They are now tracking, just in the area of carbon management alone, 200 projects under development. Now, we all know not all of those projects will happen, but it's an indicator of the level of private sector response so far. Now, I'll make this brief, but to the question about our friends and allies around the world, I think you kind of said what I would have said to this to start. I've been working on climate policy for the better part of 30 years, and so those 20 long years that you mentioned, we watched as the Waxman-Markey climate legislation failed to get across the finish line in 2009. There's been multiple other false starts. We tried to follow the pathway of European countries, the European Union and others, of taxing and regulating emissions. In the United States, it's the world's largest oil and gas producer. We have very large industrial regions that where climate policy is, there are very different views within the United States of climate policy. The way we built a political consensus to finally do our part, to put our own house in order, as I like to say, is to choose an incentive-based approach, to incentivize what we want to encourage in terms of deployment. So I guess for those that are concerned about the US approach, I implore you to at least consider that, you know, this was our way to make our global commitment to the problem. That said, and the other thing I want to say is about intent. You mentioned I was involved in, especially in the carbon capture, carbon management part of the package before I joined the Biden administration. Over a period of 10 years, we worked on what ultimately became these tax credits and worked with industry and labor unions and environmental organizations over that decade. And at no point in those discussions that led to that part of the legislation did anyone think of this as a way to attract investment away from other countries. It was all about trying to stimulate the technology deployment and innovation in our own country. So that's, I just want to emphasize, underscore that. Two, we, the United States as a country, have already benefited ourselves from the investments that other countries have made in incentivizing technology. And I'll cite two very obvious examples. Our friends and allies in Germany made an enormous investment in solar incentives. And today we are seeing solar as a very low-cost resource being deployed at very large scales thanks to that investment made by Germany in its own market. Another example is offshore wind, and we're going to hear more about offshore wind from my colleagues here on the panel. And the United States did not lead in offshore wind. We're the beneficiaries now of the investments that were made by other governments and policies to incentivize the technology. This isn't just true of wealthy countries. We're seeing solar and wind and other technologies being deployed at scale in emerging economies because we brought the costs down. So that is intentionally part of our strategy here. The final thing I'll say, though, is we're not blind to the situation, especially in Europe. My country has had a commitment to our allies in Europe since the end of World War II. These are relationships that are our highest priority, and we care a great deal about the situation, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and how the Russians have weaponized energy as a weapon of war. And so we are very concerned about the high energy prices and the economic vulnerability that's created. So then I'll stop. The U.S. Treasury and others in the Biden administration are engaging, especially with our European allies, but not just European allies, to look at opportunities for flexibility. I think some of the principal concerns are in electric vehicles and the battery incentives. And so those discussions are well underway. In some areas, we've been able to be flexible about how eligibility and allowing greater participation. In other areas, the legislation is more constraining. And so over time, we'll do our best to address what the very real concerns that our partners have, because the way we look at it, we're all in this together. And the goal is, obviously, as we heard from the Secretary this morning, is tackling this problem that affects us all.
Great. Thank you, Brad, and I think that's very important and sensitive of you to talk about the impact. Julian, let me turn to you next. Bank of America is an enormous global investor. How do you see the IRA? Is this really a step change? Does this put the U.S. at the head of the class for investment? And you see Europe as well. Does this need to be a zero-sum game between the U.S. and Europe, or is there really enough capital for everybody if they've got the right framework?
Sure. Look, I mean, I'd echo Brad's comments. I think you've got to take the IRA together with the infrastructure bill. The two, for us, very much go hand in hand. I think in terms of what flows, when you look at the analysis that we've done, you're probably talking about $1 trillion when all's said and done that's incentivized and should immediately, over the next 10 years, be flowing. So it's a dramatic shift in gears for US policy. And I think, look, if you look at, we've been big players in the rollout of infrastructure investment domestically in the US and internationally, but particularly in the US. And I think, look, we're making a massive investment in our teams. There's a huge flow of projects coming through the door, and I'd say just a lot of projects that were in that kind of gray area, would they make it, or needed something to kind of push them across the line. This is what's doing that, right? I think when you look at the sort of the pieces, I'd say, look, carbon capture and hydrogen are probably the two places where it's going to be most transformational. I'd say, look, wind, solar, and so on, it's just sort of turbocharging and putting more fuel behind what's already going there. But I think where we're seeing the most difference in terms of what's in our backlog of credible projects that we can finance, it's in that sort of CCS and hydrogen that you're seeing the most impact. What I would say is it's maybe part of the answer to how transformational is it, and the sort of, we'll come to the discussion later on, does it pull too much investment or disproportionate investment to the US? I think it's certainly putting a lot of engagement to the US. One of the interesting things is then what happens next, because take hydrogen, if you look at what we're seeing, there's a huge push for people to look at projects, but they're very keen to be first mover in the US because it's not quite clear how big and how fast the market will grow thereafter. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how it evolves. So for me, I think it's transformational versus where the US has been. It's transformational in terms of getting engagement on projects coming forward that are credible. How many of those projects get done, I think is going to be a function of supply chain issues we'll talk about later, rollout of infrastructure, which is why I think the two pieces are important to look at together. And then also look just how much follows in terms of further flows of investment, right? I mean, it's a big number, but if you look at that $1 trillion, US GDP over the next 10 years, probably what, let's say 350 trillion. So it's, you know, the actual direct is about 1/3% of US GDP. Put the pieces together, take that trillion number, okay, it's 1% of GDP, which says for this really to transform, what it needs to be is the catalyst to drive the rest of that capital to flow and coalesce around everything that comes forward. We think that will happen, but that's going to mean people taking judgments and making judgments on the development markets, which if you then go back to the European markets, in Europe, most of the incentives we've seen have been, I'd say, market-driven rather than investment-driven. So you've had two very different kind of philosophies. Maybe we can talk about that later. So.
Thank you, really helpful. And we will come back on the implementation and some of the challenges. Tim, let me turn to you next. You're on both sides of the Atlantic, Siemens is, and you're also highly focused on grid and transmission. As we've heard over the last couple of days, generation is terrific. If you don't have transmission, pretty hard to get that to the customer. So how impactful are the two bills, really, both the infrastructure bill and chips and science, if it helps as well, and the IRA for your business in the US, and then how do you see the impact in Europe?
So just to frame it, the US was always the biggest market we had. So even over the last 10, 15, 20 years, there was quite a significant business for the technologies that are the main focus of the IRR. Where we used to struggle was the old PTC regime, which was always a stop and go. You know, we had 2 years of a good run, and then it was, you know, up in the air what was going to happen. We made plans to ramp down factories, no investment, and then last minute it got extended. So I think the investment certainty on the, especially for wind and solar for the 10 years, is a big plus for the business. That's what we always, as a wind industry, ask for, having this long-term certainty so we can make these investments also in production factories. What we also see now with the IRA is, don't get me wrong, there's quite a bit of funding also available in the EU, but it's very uncertain how you access that funding. A good example is the Green Hydrogen Fund in the EU, where only 4 million is drawn. I think the US has shown with IRA very pragmatic approach, simple and speedy, and I think this is what industry wants. And we're already seeing some of those impacts on the hydrogen side. I think Europe for quite some time was leading the hydrogen discussion, pilot projects, but very small scale. We didn't see the significant investments that we need as a equipment manufacturer, large scale. It's, you know, you do this 2 megawatt, 10 megawatt projects. All of a sudden with the IRA, we're talking large scale projects in the US, firm commitment on a accelerated schedule that of course makes us rethink our investment decision. And I think this is where Europe will need a response if they want to keep the investments for production facilities also in the in Europe. I think in my opinion, where the IRA falls a bit short is the focus on transmission. It's very much on generation, and we've seen over the last 2 years how the transmission side is running into serious bottlenecks, both in Europe, but I believe also now that we see this accelerated curve of investments in the US, and we had the discussion with one of the offshore projects in the US on Northeast. He wanted to have the HVDC connection, and we told him, yeah, we can deliver, but 1 year later than you need it when you need to be online. So I think that's one of the focus areas. If we want to do this build out, we have to make sure we are also able to move the electrons from A to B onshore, permitting, big area that I think needs a bit more attention if you want to have the full impact of the IRA in the US.
And because of the nature of our federal system, that's necessarily involving the states and some of the regional transmission authorities, so it's complicated. Just to stay on your hydrogen point for a minute, so then given the fact that we're going to have these hydrogen hubs, we're spending more money on it, do you associate yourself then with the argument that there will be lessons learned that will be helpful to Europe, that we're sort of, this is a little bit of a utility when it comes to learning on hydrogen?
I think it's the very clear, the production credits on hydrogen, the investment tax credits. I think it's a very straightforward business case that you can make in the US that in Europe you couldn't make. And that's, I think, where a lot of our customers said we will try out as small scale because they didn't know what's the offtake on the hydrogen, how do we make a business out of it. And I think in the US it's you see the path how you're going to make money with hydrogen.
Great. Ben, let me turn to you next and ask about, I know you have a perspective both on onshore wind and offshore wind, and also a bit of a global perspective. So are these bills a big deal for the offshore wind and onshore wind industry in the United States? Do you think this provides any help or learnings for the rest of the industry?
Yeah, thanks, David, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to be here, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for organizing this panel. In short, I mean, we're delighted as an industry with the IRA. I mean, we're very, very happy for all the reasons that the panelists have outlined. It gives us 10-year certainty and predictability that we've never really had in the US, even though the US has always been a strong market. We've never had this kind of certainty before. We like the way that it fits together with other sectors as well, everything from green steel and cement to hydrogen to EVs. I mean, it's a holistic approach. And above all, I mean, what we like about it is it's a kind of blunt instrument. It's quite clear how you access it, as other panelists have said. Anybody can access it by law if once it's there. And it's really up to the private sector then to go and deliver within that framework. So I like the kind of blunt instrument nature of it. And given where we are with the energy transition, the targets that have been set by governments are truly gargantuan across the world. So we're looking at a really enormous expansion over 30 years. I mean, just to throw out a couple of figures, in the IEA net zero by 2050, we're supposed to get to 8.3 terawatts of wind energy by 2050 in that scenario. The IRENA WETO scenario is actually very similar. It's 8 terawatts. Both of them have 2 terawatts of offshore wind within those scenarios. They both imply a very fast ramp up by 2030. So the IEA would like to see a ramp up to 390 gigawatts of wind by the end of this decade. And at the moment, we're just above 100. And we're about to pass the first terawatt this year. Right? And we've got to get to 8 in the next 30 years. So there's a considerable acceleration. And that's going to require the combined efforts of the whole world. Right? So we need everyone to take their place and to speed up. And if you look at manufacturing capacity around the world, it's actually not that big. And a lot of that has been because of stop-go cycles, political cycles. So we've underinvested in a way in the supply chain. If you look at where Europe's targets are under REPowerEU, they need probably about 40 gigawatts of capacity, manufacturing capacity per year to meet those targets. At the moment, they've got about 24, 25 gigawatts of capacity. So they need to ramp up in Europe. The US is going to need to ramp up significantly, especially on offshore wind where there isn't a supply chain. And to take to give a kind of an example of this, in offshore wind, it's pretty much been the same people and the same products moving around the world because of the kind of stop-go nature of things. So yeah, you bump into the same engineers that did North Sea offshore wind in Taiwan, and then you bump into them in the US, and it's the same people kind of planning. There won't be that kind of margin anymore. The whole market is going to tighten massively, and the labor market, there's going to be big labor skills and labor shortages. There's going to be a real tightening of the supply chain globally. There's 120 gigawatt of supply chain capacity globally at the moment, and we're going to go to 107 this year. So really from next year on, everything tightens. And the IRA will have a significant effect in tightening the market, right? But I guess the important thing is it's not about taking investment from one place and it going somewhere else. We shouldn't see this as a competitive thing at all. And as the wind industry, we've said very, very clearly in Europe and to the European Commission, we should be emulating this. We should be doing an IRA for Europe that's easy to access, that provides the same amount of support, that provides profitable, a profitable framework for building renewables, and build fast, spend quickly, right? As Brad said, that's what's needed for the energy transition. So I think establishing that framework, first of all, doing this in a cooperative way and realizing that we're all going to need to invest at a much faster pace, I think is step one. The other question, which I think we could dig into a bit later, is cost, because this will have cost implications. I mean, we're already seeing it. I mean, probably for 10 or 15 years, we've been saying wind power is going to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. It's not getting any cheaper. It's significantly more expensive because steel's more expensive, copper's more expensive, labor's more expensive, and we're going to see a higher cost. The good news is that we're still going to be competitive versus fossil fuels. I mean, because of high fossil fuel prices, high LNG prices in particular, it's actually it's actually a significantly more cost-effective to do renewables than it is to do fossils. So I'm not really worried about the kind of relative costs, but the costs are going to go up across all energy industries. And I think just one final one of this, and then I'll stop. The other element of this obviously is China. Over 50% of the supply chain is in China. And it's not just Chinese companies, it's also European companies. It's been GE over the years. It's been globalized companies that have large parts of their supply chain in China. And if we're then saying also we're going to reshore to Europe and we're going to reshore to the US, and we're going to do this within this kind of fairly short time frame, that's going to add considerable costs as well. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be an effort, and I do think there should be a rebalancing of the supply chain. We can't have this kind of dependence on one particular country or region, right? There needs to be a rebalancing. But the idea is somehow that everybody reshores raw materials, rare earths, steel production into their own areas. For me, that's something that needs to be looked at with a very kind of cold and calculating idea. So I'll leave it there, but my message is, as the wind industry, we're very, very supportive of what the US is doing, and we'd like to see other areas, countries, regions adopting similar approaches.
Great, really helpful comments. And it's probably worth noting on the workforce development piece that there's both money in the legislation to try and promote it, and at least the US developers, I think both Equinor and Ørsted are trying to engage in project labor agreements and basically train a new workforce in the US to try and get ahead of that problem. But it'll be a race between how quickly that workforce gets developed and when the projects get built. Lee, let me turn to you. You are a true Atlanticist as well as an Atlantic Council, a former fellow and currently associated with us. I'd like to talk about two things. One, with Clean Air Task Force, you've got a perspective on the European model and how it compares and whether it's working. But you also, I know, have some views on what the IRA does for advanced technologies. So if you could talk a little bit about sort of the impact of the bill, but also, how you see, the US model versus the European model and what's good for Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, David, for having me here today, and to the Atlantic Council, thanks everyone for coming. For those of you who don't know the Clean Air Task Force, we're a global climate organization. We focus on overlooked solutions and energy systems transformation in the US, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. The technologies we focus on are carbon capture, hydrogen, nuclear, infrastructure, methane, so a whole host of areas that we worked on in the Inflation Reduction Act and globally. And I think the panel already summarized really, really nicely that the complexity of tackling climate change, the energy transition, that we need to build industries, that it's about really making sure we're having adaptive climate policy making. It's not just one and done, but really thinking about the infrastructure vision of the industries and next generation technologies we need to commercialized essentially, and that takes time, that takes dedication, it needs infrastructure, so we can't just build a single facility of each technology, but need to have multiple of each to bring down the cost, enable learning by doing. We need infrastructure, CO2 transport, hydrogen transfer, transmission, we've heard it all. So there's a comprehensive infrastructure vision that enables us to really commercialize technologies. Another piece that I think is really important is climate as a political economy outcome. There's often this idea, oh, we're going to do climate because of climate, but really it has to be the outcome of the nexus of industry, innovation, business, labor, as we heard. So I just wanted to emphasize some of these points that were really important. Going to Europe, I think Europe has made incredible gains on climate policy. The European emissions trading system, really good example of global climate policy example, but it's not innovation policy, right? So there's two pieces here. We need to lay out a pathway for reducing emissions in the long term, but we still need to commercialize the technologies. And so climate policy alone cannot commercialize the technologies, and bringing this back to the Inflation Reduction Act, that's exactly what it does, right? So I think there is lessons to learn here from both sides of the Atlantic. I think to a response this week, we've seen Commissioner Breton tour European capitals. We've seen the state aid relaxation rules on green investment. So I think we're expecting a European response to actually a global trend of climate forward industrial policy, not just in the US, we're seeing it in India, other places. And I think it also has positive spillover effects if we're looking, for example, Canada immediately reacted with its own incentives for next-gen tech. It enabled the US to come together here with the UAE on the PACE initiative. So I think there's a lot of positive global effects for climate that we would like to highlight. The last thing that I will say is a clean US, a clean Europe is not the end game, it's just the beginning. So when we talk about the cost reductions, the learning by doing, labor force development, it's really, and as we're looking to COP28, how can the US and Europe work together to essentially lay the framework for harvesting those innovation gains globally. So we need to look at the rest of the world not just as a consumer of technology, but a place where we can help foster indigenous innovation, build out expertise, infrastructure, do more analysis on really how that infrastructure vision can play out. So I think that's what we're looking forward as we're essentially laying the path to COP28 and making adaptive climate policy.
Great, really helpful. Well, all the exciting conversations about how much money and how fast we're going to move, generally quickly move to challenges about implementation. Can we move the money fast enough out of the department? What are the other challenges in terms of value chain? Can we get the regulations out in time to move things? So, Tim, I've heard you talk about this before, so I want to give people a chance to talk about what their biggest worries are when it comes to implementation, and then Brad, give you a chance at the end to respond to how the department, how the government at large is trying to manage this.
I mean, for me, the biggest concern I have is the supply chain on transmission. It's not so much on wind or solar. I think we have capacity there. It's much more a focus on, at least for the technology companies, on can you make a decent return on what you sell? And interestingly enough, we operate in industries where we have just a few players. We look at offshore wind, but all of them are not making money. And I think at the end, you can only run a sustainable business if there's an adequate return. The transmission piece, for me, is the concern, especially there, the what we call grid access, connecting the offshore wind, but also moving the electrons over large distances with HVDC. We just got a large order after Christmas, and those are 2 offshore platforms for operation in 2030 and 2031.
Wow.
So in terms of delivery times on power equipment, we're up to 3 years. And on these big projects that we need in order to do the connections, it's really going into the 2030s plus. And there, my view is always, it went from the suppliers trying to win projects to customers trying to win the suppliers. And the industry, if you disregard Chinese suppliers, we only have 3 suppliers that can do these large complex projects. Now, in my opinion, it moves to a competition of regulators. What regulator provides the best boundary conditions in terms of planning certainty, de-risking? And that's us, that's also the big cable manufacturers, where it's also, just a handful. We had the discussion in the UK with National Grid and, quite big investments. Europe, big investments. Germany alone is going to spend 100 billion euros until 2030, the 4 TSOs. And at the end, for us, it's where can I go, where do I have the greatest certainty? And we've seen now frame contracts, 5, 6, 7 large projects being tendered in one go, up to 2035, 2036, and for a supplier that gives a lot of certainty. And that's where we go, where we feel we have the best risk-reward scheme. And I think that's also what I said earlier. We're having these discussions with the DOE, but I think that's where the US needs to catch up, because otherwise we do this big build-out and we'll face bottlenecks on the grid side, on the transmission.
Regulatory speed has not been our wheelhouse. I think
Yeah.
I think that's probably fair.
But that's across the globe. It's
That's great. Julian, do you want to come in on this also? I mean, you alluded to this in your earlier comments, but where do you see the real implementation challenges?
Well, I'd echo Tim's comments on infrastructure, but it's not a finance question, because I think that's actually where there's the most money waiting to move. It's on what conditions and with the right frame. So I think certainly if I talk to the national grids or SSEs back where my home base is in the UK, I mean, look, there's big commitments of what they could be doing. It's all down to, well, how fast can I move, which is back to the approval. So it's a global issue. I think on the supply chain side, I think just 2 anecdotes. I mean, look, I think we've got some clients who are saying, look, I need to go move upstream in a way I wouldn't normally plan on doing to acquire the supply chain. So I think you're going to see some fairly aggressive and strategic moves in response to the supply chain issues, which may actually then exacerbate issues for others. So I think that's one thing to watch. I can see that happening. The other, there's a couple of projects that we're looking at in the US where actually, because the only place you can get the supply chain fastest than my first mover point, they're probably still going to go to China and refinance later once the project's up and running, and even equity finance it because they can see the opportunity just because everything's moving. But question mark, the best way of moving faster so you're not stuck with a supply chain issue is actually still to go to China. So look, I think all those, I think, are some of the challenges. I would also, though, just echo what was said earlier in terms of the benefits. I do think when we look at it, you're going to see significant benefits in terms of cost. The only challenge is from a US versus elsewhere, if Europe doesn't respond and other places don't respond, is that the dollars are going to move first and fastest towards the US, and we can already see a lot of our European clients moving much more aggressively into the US than before, and also starting to look at citing their own supply chains, whether it's Panasonic, BMW, NL, others you've seen recently. So I think that's something which is definitely happening, but you're still going to see the benefits flow later, as Brad says, the same way as you've seen the benefits flow from Europe to the US, but later you're going to see the same thing that happen in reverse. So.
Thank you. So, Brad, you've heard about a couple of the parade of horribles there, and then there's just the additional questions I'd add are getting the basic regulations out of Treasury. How are you going to manage domestic content? Who can take advantage of the credits? So I know there's always a tension between getting it fast and getting it right, especially in a highly litigious environment with a lot of oversight from Congress. But how do you see this? Because moving fast on regulation is never a strength of bureaucracies. So how do you see the outlook for getting the regulations out and getting the definitions out and addressing some of the challenges you've heard from the panel?
Yeah, I laugh because last few months, I feel like some days I experience the tension of getting it right and doing it fast multiple times every day. And I jotted some things down. First of all, I agree with everything that my private sector colleagues have said, and I'll just start. So permitting, we literally need to scale up regulation, and I think it's right. It's not just the United States, it's a global problem. Certainly in societies where there's active participation of stakeholders in the permitting process in terms of providing public comment, you know, citizens and stakeholders in a country like the United States, and not only the United States, play a serious role in informing both whether projects get developed and to some varying degrees how they get developed, and that's as it should be. But that doesn't mean that we still have to do more faster, even from a permitting and regulatory standpoint. And I'll just cite one illustrative example, not because it's necessarily the only important one, but I just know it very well. We have an underground injection program for geologic storage. It's called Class 6. There are a series of different wells. And just a few years ago, there were only a handful of permits applications into the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for Class 6 geologic storage permits. We're now, last I heard, well past, approaching 30 or 40, and our own projections are we're going to be well above 100 soon. And we have regions of the country that until recently only had 1 or 2 EPA staff to do these permits, and some of them were on the verge of retirement. So I mean, you can just imagine that what you think about the billions we're about to spend on carbon management, and but for a few $1 million worth of investment in human capital, it could all fall apart. So that's just an example of how acute this this challenge is. The other thing is the Inflation Reduction Act transforms our tax code with respect to incentivizing clean energy and industrial technologies. I worked extensively with the Internal Revenue Service on the Section 45Q tax credit. I learned that for most of the energy tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, the staff is 4 at the Internal Revenue Service, 4 people. So what we did in the Department of Energy is we put together a cross-cutting team across the entire department, and we are literally helping and supporting and advising the IRS for across the tax code for these different sections, for the different technologies that we're incentivizing, to try to get the guidance developed, gather input, get that done as fast as possible so that the market can respond and fulfill the purpose of these incentives. But we were not structured to do that. The other thing is,
sorry, did you get more staff, or are you cannibalizing your own staff to support?
We're donating our staff time from, we're not a regulatory agency, but we're donating our technical expertise because the Internal Revenue Service doesn't have the technical expertise and they literally don't have the bodies to do it. So it's a joint effort. They're obviously making the final decisions.
But I was asking, did you get more staff of your own to be able to implement
No,
stuff? Yeah.
we didn't. And then commercial scale demonstration, as I mentioned before, we weren't doing commercial scale demonstration as a government. Private sector was left to do that largely on their own. Now we are standing up an entire new office called the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which is great, and I'm hugely supportive of it. But what it means is the traditional process of getting funding out the door is now shared across offices, across the technology spectrum. And that's as it should be, but you don't create that overnight. So even as we have to get all this money out the door, we've also had to restructure the agency to meet this new policy imperative. The final piece on the governmental side, human capital. If our Inflation Reduction Act is successful along with the infrastructure bill, we are going to see deployment on a scale we've never had before. What does that mean? That anybody with qualifications, the private sector will want to hire them, and it's well known that governments do not pay as well as industry. So we're trying to hire the best and the brightest at the time we're supercharging project development in the private sector, and so that's a huge challenge. The final one that hasn't been talked about, and I think this is the biggest one. If the projections that we've all heard about the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill are, I'll just say unscientifically, half right, okay? We are going to be challenged on the ground to deploy these technologies, not just because of permitting and supply chains, but because of community and stakeholder support. We are seeing already across the United States growing local opposition to projects. And it's not just fossil energy-based projects, you know, CO2 pipelines or geologic storage. It's transmission lines, it's wind farms, it's solar projects. And so we are, at the same time, we're having to do all the things I just outlined. We're having to rethink as a federal department in the United States government how we engage with the public to make sure that that first of all, that communities benefit in a way where they will support these projects, tangible economic and environmental benefits going to communities and workers, but also just more broadly to build the public understanding that's necessary. People won't support this kind of infrastructure and project development if they don't appreciate both the benefits to themselves and the broader purposes that it's to accomplish. And that requires us to engage at a local and regional level in a way that we've never done before. So that's a whole new dimension to the task.
Right, there are environmental justice considerations, not only from the administration's own EJ program, but also built into the bill. So you're consulting more broadly at the same time you're trying to go fast.
And I would note it's environmental justice, but it's also landowners, farmers, ranchers, local government officials. They all have a say in these things, and they all have to be engaged and participate. And we're figuring out our role to try to help support all that.
I want to talk about China, but we've got a lot of talent in the audience too. So anyone's got a question, you want to just raise your hand or stand up. We're happy to take questions. But I want to turn to China next. We sort of learned the last year that you want to be very careful about abandoning the system that you have until the system that you want to put in place is ready for action. So I think, as Ben pointed out, right now a lot of the material for the clean energy world is sited in China. And the tax incentives make it clear that by 2024, you need to start phasing out dependence on China if you want to take advantage of these tax credits. So it's a little unclear if we're building out the supply chain here and everything from batteries to nacelles to monopiles to whatever, but that's going to take a little time, but you're not going to be able to rely on Chinese inputs to take advantage of the tax credit in 2 years. How does that all fit together? Do we expect essentially the tax credits really not to be taken up very significantly, or how do we square that circle? Because it seems like it'll be hard to get to building out that value chain in the U.S. or even from free trade partners, however you define them, by 2024.
You're starting with me?
Starting with you.
Well, so I think we don't turn the situation around in a year or two. And you've heard from many people at this event, and we've all heard for years, for those in the energy industry, we're talking about capital stock for large-scale capital-intensive projects doesn't turn over quickly. As you point out, we've now also come to a even greater appreciation of the supply chains that even make that possible. One of the advantages in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, and I would say this was intentional, is that you can choose to have an investment tax credit for some of the tax credits where you get the money up front as you make investments in project construction. Many of them are production tax credits. They're performance-based. Once your project is placed in commercial service, then you can start to claim the tax credit. So what that means with the 10-year window to begin construction is, to the extent that building up supply chains and some of the delays that we're talking about, since many of the tax credits have a beginning construction formulation, that does mean that in the back end of this 10-year period, we can still have projects begin construction and claim the tax credit. So that's at least a bit of a safety valve if we run into some of these delays. The only other thing I would point out is that it's just to underscore, we have learned how deeply vulnerable we are, especially like critical minerals. And so if you look at the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the discussions that are now going on within the US federal government with industry, this is really an all hands on deck effort. It hasn't all come to fruition yet. There's more to come. But we are not only, and it's not just thinking about the United States, we are acutely vulnerable to our dependence on China, not for only mineral production, but processing as well. But we're looking at investing in and supporting supply chains in other countries because it's a global market. The minerals can go to our country or another country, but they help support that global market and keeping costs manageable. The other thing we're thinking about is how do we add real value in the countries that produce these minerals. We've heard from many of our colleagues at this event from Africa in how it's not just energy access, it's also economic diversification, value-added economic development. And we have an opportunity as we build out these supply chains for the first time in decades to add real social and economic value to these countries that are supplying these critical minerals for this development.
Good. Anyone else want to come in on the China question? So, Lee and then Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I will just say from a European perspective, 95% of critical minerals supply a lot of manufacturing, of clean energy technologies. So this highlights really risk management of the energy transition. And looking at the IEA report that was released this week, and also a workshop we had on securing net zero Europe, earlier this week with the Atlantic Council, I think it became very, very clear that as we're trying to diversify away from one problem, we don't want to become dependent on the other. But then, again, the way to do this is smarter industrial policy and better strategic partnerships, right? So from a European perspective, I think what we're looking towards also, as we're seeing 2024 European election, is what comes after the EU Green Deal in terms of what bridges 55 and 100% or 55% emissions reductions to climate neutrality, and then what does this mean in terms of energy security and geopolitics, and really how can we create a more sustainable and flexible system of clean energy production, manufacturing, and I think there's a lot of unanswered questions in Europe of how we're really going to realize these industries, commercialize technologies fast enough, enable flexibility. I think we all talked before this panel that it's really, really difficult to access support for clean energy technology deployment in Europe. It's much faster now in the United States. So speed, scale, yesterday you mentioned legitimacy, that goes to the communities, but also where do the materials come from? And then efficiency and agility. And I think a lot of this has not been really reflected in climate policy yet. And in this new world of polycrisis, we really have to have this adaptive policymaking approach where we're constantly asking what's the risk management approach we need to really ensure that we don't have a disruptive system as we've seen it over the past year play out in Europe. So that would be my answer.
Great insight. Ben?
Yeah, thanks. And those are really great points from Lee. Just a couple of reflections. I mean, there is a level of naivety, I think, in some areas around reshoring. I grew up in the UK. It's high population density. We spent a lot of time decommissioning heavy industry. Even where I grew up, I grew up actually right next to a big coal-fired power plant in a port. And and as I grew up, that was basically a problem to clean up, right? And it's really hard to imagine the difficulty we have permitting a wind farm or a solar farm that we're going to permit a big chemicals plant or bring the steel industry completely back to Europe or create rare earth metal refineries, refining processes. It's just really hard to imagine that's going to happen or that people are going to want that, which goes to Brad's point, which is that the energy transition has a big impact on people. It's a big spatial impact, and there's big impacts in the supply chain as well that need to be managed in a really equitable and fair way. And we're already seeing the massive pushback around mining practices in Africa around cobalt and nickel production in Indonesia and in Africa and so on, right? So all these things need to be managed in a way that we're kind of eyes open, and it needs to be a cooperative framework of discussion where people know what they're getting out of it, and that there is some equity in terms of what the producers of raw materials are getting out of it. In the 1970s, as everyone here knows very well, the world had to come together and manage oil stocks, right? It was so strategic that there had to be a cooperative approach, and the IEA was formed, and there was global stock management, right? We need a similar approach for the energy transition. We need to look at this really strategically and think about how this plays out and who's in a position to produce things in the best way, how that impacts populations and people's buy-ins. Now, China needs to be part of that conversation, and we need to, in a way, create this kind of discussion around strategic inputs for the green transition, around green tech corridors, and somehow how do we take out the whole transition out of the realm of trade wars? What's been really, really unhelpful is kind of taking this kind of trade approach to everything and seeing it as this kind of competitive zero-sum game, right? I mean, how do we realize the benefits in a cooperative way and in an equitable way? So, I mean, I'd really like to see more emphasis on this. I'd like to see people bringing together these discussions in the appropriate forums, and I believe it will require setting up new institutions, probably, of cooperation as well. And again, I mean, it's good, really good to see the US back into this discussion as well at the COPs and at many other forums as well. And we're going to need everybody around that table.
Julian, did you want to come on this?
Yeah, just a couple of things quickly. I think, look, one, I think you just can't unplug at speed. So I just think there's a reality regardless of IRA or everything else. And that example I gave of that hydrogen project earlier is a good one where it's, look, if I can be my first mover and things are moving in the States, I'll actually want to be one of the first projects out there. And if that means China, I'll take the tax credits later or I'll do something later on in the game. The other bit I think is just on when you look forward, I think one of the things which I think no one's really planning for is what does that future metals environment look like, and what does the OPEC of new metals look like in the future, and how do you plan for that and plan around that? And I think one of the bits that I get frustrated with is saying this, it's not a joined up conversation when you see new government coming in, somewhere like Chile, saying, look, we're going to set all these kind of constraints on our emissions. Great, but actually you almost want Chile to go long on emissions so it can go big in lithium so that the rest of the world can get off. So that kind of joined up thinking I don't really see happening. That's not to the topic today really, but I think that's one future sort of challenge that's ahead of us.
Really important. Well, we've had some good suggestions about how to not make this into a trade war, and how to make Europe, in a sense, more competitive. So I want to sort of end on that high note. And Lee, I'm going to start with you because you first put this idea into my head. But maybe do a lightning round and then let you have last word, Brad. But how would you like to see the European response or the U.S.-European response? We've had the threats of WTO, or maybe Europe is going to to have more nationalistic policies. But I think everybody has talked about there's a smarter, better way to do this, which is not destructive on both sides, but kind of lifts all ships. So let's have all of your brainstorms on this. And Lee, I know you thought about this, so let me start.
Yeah, wow, this is a big question. I think, first of all, really focusing on the positives, especially, of course, for climate, is really, really important. What are the cost gains, the innovation gains? Then using the channels that we've already established, and David, you're sitting here in the front row, was mentioning Clean Energy Ministerial and Multilateral Fora really as an opportunity to harvest innovation gains and knowledge sharing. So I think working together, the European response, for example, on the carbon capture issue was Denmark, Germany, others are all moving because they're seeing it move in other places, particularly in the US. So really finding synergies on next-gen tech, on how to work together. I think the US and Romania on nuclear is another great example. So I think for climate, it's really about the positive story. And then for Europe, again, as I said earlier, there's a 45% emissions gap in planning, in policy, as we're looking at the EU Green Deal, which aimed at 55% emissions reductions for 2030. So I think really thinking about a package that can help alleviate the short-term energy crisis, or double down on on Repower EU essentially, but then lays out the pathway for Europe to invest in next-gen tech, better plan and understand what kind of infrastructure is needed to alleviate. I think we haven't really talked about the planning issue. For the sooner we can understand the infrastructure we need, the better we can plan, work with communities, prepare pre-permit, identify spatial situations where we can deploy technologies. So I think it's really about, of course, an industrial policy response, but it's also more about this climate as an infrastructure and climate as a political economy outcome response that I would like to see after the EU Green Deal.
Terrific. We've got about a minute and a half, so we're doing lightning rounds, but those are great ideas. Ben?
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I mean, what I'd like to see, I mean, people have talked about it, government scaling up, and this whole idea that Tim talked about, competition of regulators. We need to take that really seriously now. We can't have government slowing down this whole transition. I guess the second thing is, we're going to need everything and more. We're moving into a new world, so we should be worrying about how we're going to lay hands on everything that we're going to need. And in fact, some of the things Tim said actually scared me even more than I was scared before I came to this panel, when you think about lead times and where we are. And then thirdly, I think we need to move the climate discussion much more onto the realm of implementation. I think at COP28 that is the intention, and our discussions we've had with the UAE presidency, it very much seems that that's the intention, to get the discussion on implementation. We don't have time to have kind of endless discussions about where we're going, or how the kind of general parameters. We need to move into a kind of implementation phase, and that needs to be cooperative, and it will probably require new institutions as well.
Terrific. Tim?
I think it's great to see that both Europe and the United States are pushing the energy transition agenda, and we see that throughout the various programs. I think there's enough money available on both sides of the Atlantic, IRA, also Green Deal. At the end, it's all about how do you make it simple and speedy to access the money to support the energy transition. If we can do that, I think we're on a great track.
Just to build on that, fully agree. I think the money is available. You look at 2 of our most highly attended equity conferences globally in the last 12, 18 months were on hydrogen. That's on the equity side. It's like, where are the projects? Likewise, I think us and other banks, plenty of capital for the right projects. So, look, I think back to what we talked about, I think when I look at it, the US is driving incentives on the development side, which I think is great. I think they should look to the US, look to Europe and say, look, what should states be doing, and other parts of the US set up to drive the market incentives, to drive the market to follow that. And the reverse is true in Europe. I mean, Europe has driven things mostly through market incentives. And I think looking and saying, look, could we be doing something similar, like the IRA or something equivalent? It would drive everything forward.
So it says it's time's up, so I'll be super fast. First of all, as a US official, I'm not going to suggest what the Europeans should do. But 2 things. No, seriously, yes. But 2 things. One, we are working really hard now in those areas where sincere targeted concerns about the Inflation Reduction Act have been brought up. Within the flexibility, as an administration, we can only do what's within the law. And so to the extent that we have flexibility within the law, we're actively working to try to find some common ground with our European partners on their concerns, and we will continue to do that. We take that very seriously. And then publicly, from the president on down, building on what others have said, but particularly Lee just said, President Biden has welcomed other European countries to craft a climate-oriented industrial policy similar to what we have done, and that's sincere. And that's part of the spirit of this, was never to advantage the U.S. from an investment standpoint, and we would view it an effort from a European side. Similarly, we would see it in the climate terms of trying to drive innovation and deployment for our shared objectives and gain.
Terrific. 2 things. First, I want to remind everybody, Kadri Simpson will be here on the stage for a fireside chat at 5 o'clock. We welcome you all back. Second, I want to thank the panelists for terrific insights and for your optimism on the steps forward. And so let's have a round of applause for them.